Well, good day, Prescott, and thank you again for tuning in to Prescott eNews Prescott Talks show. My name is Glenn Martin, and I'm your host. And today, I'm very proud to bring in our publisher, Mr. David Stringer, who is running for county attorney for Yavapai County. Thank you so much for coming in, David.
Well, Glenn, it's great to be here. We've been doing these podcasts, and I guess we don't want to make it any secret to our viewers here that I am the publisher of eNews. But I think these podcasts have been going on before I became more actively involved in eNews. And you've done dozens and dozens of these things. We've got great responses to them. We've had just about every candidate in I can think of. We invite everybody to come in and do these things. I held off because I am the publisher, and I don't want to kind of take advantage of that position or overly politicize eNews or make it too much of a vehicle for David Stringer.
I'm glad that you came in, David.
I appreciate
because
that.
Because I'll tell you, and for the folks that are watching this, I'm a pretty independent guy, as you are.
You are.
And we are doing this interview, and there's been no conversation about any of the questions or where we're going. And David has always given me the ability to ask what I want to ask. And
I hope so.
So this is very honest.
Intent.
This is a very honest back and forth. Again, I want to make it very clear that I invite Sheila Polk on the show as well to talk about her issues. But today we have David, and we're going to talk about the issues that are going on within Yavapai County.
I appreciate that. I like to, for me, Glenn, and I'm not a newcomer to political work. I've been involved in a number of elections over the last few years here in the county and here in Prescott. For me, politics is about ideas. It's not about personalities. Unfortunately, you sometimes get into personalities. When people make attacks on you, you got to respond. Sometimes your personality reflects your policies and how you present yourself to the public. So you can't say personalities are completely excluded from the discussion, but I try to focus on ideas. That's why I'm involved in political work, is because I care about ideas that I think are important to our country, important to this community. So I'm delighted to be here and talk about ideas. And just on the issue of my opponent, Ms. Polk, she has been here. She has been invited.
Yes.
And I know she's actually not just been invited, but she's actually been in to do a podcast or two.
Right.
I don't have any role whatsoever in those events. I don't pick your guests.
No,
do
you
I?
don't.
And I don't tell you.
Told me not to have anybody.
In fairness, I probably have made a suggestion or two about, have you considered inviting this or that person? But I don't control the agenda here. I'm never here when you tape, and it's pretty much your show.
Yeah.
It's late in the campaign, so I thought it'd be appropriate for me to do at least one podcast.
Well,
and that's
I
why I'm here
appreciate
today.
you coming.
So go ahead. This is unscripted as far as you're concerned.
And ready to go. So again, one of the things that I want to bring out right at the beginning, and I like to talk about the current subjects, but I want to talk a little bit about 1983 and some of your past that went on. And I want you to explain to the folks kind of your point of view, because there's a lot of misrumors. I watched Channel 3 and I watched that guy and the reporter, and I'm going, that's not what he said if you look at the whole thing. And so there's a lot of information out there. David, explain.
I think that certainly is true. There's a lot of misinformation, and the further back you go, the more misinformation you find as far as the media reports. When I was in the legislature in the months leading up to my resignation, and I think voters understand, I was placed in a position where the best course of action for me was to resign. And let me just preface everything by saying it's pretty well known in the community now that I had a case in Maryland in 1983. I was accused of some very salacious kinds of things. But what is left out of the story is that I was exonerated. I was completely exonerated. I was a lawyer. I was admitted to practice law, I think, in 1978. I was a lawyer in 1983, and lawyers are subject to pretty tough standards. Quite frankly, the Bar Association vets their attorneys, and they do character and background investigation. And when a lawyer gets involved with the law, gets charged with any kind of a legal infraction, they take it very, very seriously. So in early 1984, the D.C. Bar Association looked into my situation, and they determined that there was no moral turpitude, and that they took no action against me, that the facts of my case did not warrant any form of disciplinary action. So I was completely exonerated by the D.C. Bar Association. The events in 1983, the case, the charges, in no way affected my career. I've been a lawyer in good standing for over 40 years. The original case, the case of 1983, was resolved, I believe, in January of 1984, and that's the Bar Association did their investigation subsequent to that. But the important thing to remember is that I was never convicted. I was never convicted, and the Maryland courts actually expunged the case. Right? So it's a legal nullity. And they did that decades ago. So I don't want to say I had forgotten about the matter, but it was so far in the past, and because there had never been any real publicity surrounding the events in 1983. I wasn't in the Baltimore Sun or on TV or anything like that. The case was understood to be a relatively minor case. No case is really minor if you're involved in it. But it didn't generate any publicity. It didn't impact my career. I was exonerated by the bar. The Maryland courts expunged the matter. I was never convicted. I never pled guilty. The charges arose from frankly, an emotionally disturbed adolescent who had made other allegations against other people. And I don't want to blame him because I think he was at least a sympathetic character as a disturbed adolescent. And I sort of was able to extricate myself from the situation without serious damage to my career. So I feel kind of grateful and lucky from that standpoint. And I sort of feel sympathetic towards this young man who was caught up in the system. And I don't know what kind of services they provided to him. I hope things worked out for him. I don't have any lingering animosity or anything of that sort. I feel fortunate that it's like, you get into an accident. You get hit by a car or something like that, and you recover. And you're just great. It's not fair that you got hit by the car, but you made a good recovery, and you're just grateful that you're able to go on with your life. And that's sort of the way I viewed it. So I was caught off guard and surprised in, I believe it was December of 2018, when a reporter from the Phoenix New-Times left a note or a message at my office inquiring about a 1983 charge in Baltimore, Maryland. And since the matter had been expunged, I didn't respond. There's no reason to go into that. And then later in January, I believe, of 19, they released their report. The problem with the newspaper reporting is that they were coming to it from a bias, if you will. The Phoenix New-Times is kind of a new age liberal publication. I had already been in the legislature for a term. I had established a reputation of being a very conservative guy. And they were happy to report anything negative. They said they got a tip, that somebody tipped them off. We don't know if it was a tip or not. But they also reported that they had contacted the Maryland courts to try to verify things, and they had learned that the case had been expunged, and that the Maryland courts had told them that this material had, whatever they had, was improperly released, and they should not publish it because it had been expunged. It was a legal nullity. And the other problem is they didn't have all the reports. So the problem with the publication, the original publication by the Phoenix New-Times, I believe it was in January, late January of 2019. I had just recently been sworn in to my second term in the state legislature, is that, number one, they were told by the Maryland judiciary that this case has been expunged, that it's a legal nullity. It's against the law in Maryland to release expunged documents. And there's a very important reason for that. If you expunge a case and there are some bits and fragments that don't get expunged, that can be extremely misleading. It's like tearing a few pages out of a book. You tear 2 or 3 pages out of the book, that doesn't tell you what the book is about. That can be very, very misleading about what this book is really about. And that's all the Phoenix New-Times had. My understanding is that whatever documents they had, they were never authenticated by the Maryland court. So they are just photocopies that could have been doctored. I don't know. I'm not making that allegation, but they're not certified copies of anything from the Maryland judiciary. The Phoenix News-Times was told not to publish these things, that they were expunged. They were released, I guess they said by mistake. That was the report. But they went ahead and did it anyway. And then other media organizations like the Arizona Republic and the Capital Times, they picked up on these very salacious allegations against me, against David Stringer. And I understand how the media game works.
Oh, yeah.
You know, scandal.
Especially against conservatives.
Especially against conservatives. Although I don't want to make myself sound like a victim, because believe me, I'm not a victim. I've had a lot of success in life, and I feel pretty strong, and I don't feel like I'm a victim. You know, I put myself into political work. Nobody forced me to do this. So, you know, you kind of man up and sort of take whatever comes. But they certainly did exploit the story, and I understand that, because scandal sells. Anything to do with sex sells. They love to put sex in a story. And, you know, there are politicians all over the country who are being snarked out and who are being, you know, castigated and ridiculed in the press for these kinds of things. Our own president, President Trump, was it a year or so ago, when he was being accused and sued of paying off call girls and things like that. Those stories kind of went away because there was nothing to them. But the press likes to exploit these stories for everything they're worth, and that's sort of what's happened. That's what happened to me. It did precipitate an investigation by the Ethics Committee in the House of Representatives. I did not realize at the time. You know, when you're in politics, you have supporters and you have people who oppose you. You have friends, you have enemies. I did not realize the extent that my political enemies would go to try to hurt my career. And I think some of that came from Yavapai County. I think it's no secret that I was, you know, I won in 2016. I won again big in 2018. I was the second highest vote getter in the state for a House race in 2018. And that was after some allegations that I had made racial comments. The voters rejected that and reelected me overwhelmingly. But I think that made my political opponents very uncomfortable. How do we ever get rid of Stringer now? So they were only too happy to see me scandalized and to see me held up to public ridicule and to be accused of some salacious offenses from 1983, anything they could use. I think I am the only legislator in the entire history of the state who was subject to an ethics investigation over something that was alleged to have happened, 35 years before they were elected. Every ethics investigation I'm aware of involves something that a legislator has been alleged to have done while they were in office, some kind of abuse of their office or some kind of malfeasance in office. In my situation, there was none of that. They simply went back to an allegation that had been expunged over 35 years ago and tried to use bits and pieces of expunged material to make a case and make it look like I was some kind of a, you know, morally repugnant person and unworthy of office. One of the things that happened, Glenn, during the few months after the publication of these events, is that the Arizona Bar Association, they told me sua sponte, that means on their own initiative, opened an investigation to determine whether or not I had made appropriate disclosures when I applied for the Bar Association in Arizona in 2004, I believe I was admitted. And so they opened an investigation and they determined, they contacted the DC Bar Association, who did do a thorough investigation, but the records had all been expunged, so they didn't have the records. They had the finding that I had been exonerated, that I had not been subject to any kind of attorney discipline. So they ended up dismissing their case against me. And so so I was exonerated by the Arizona Bar. Well, this made it maybe complicated the investigation of the Ethics Committee in terms of trying to get me out or trying to sanction me in some way. So they subpoenaed some documents that we had provided to the Bar Association under court seal. Judge O'Neill had signed a sealing order for the material that was released by the DC Bar Association. This is very typical in attorney discipline cases. These are not public records any more than your medical records are public. Okay, there's certain records that
Like
are simply not, are like President Trump's tax returns. There are certain records that are simply private and are never made public. And so the Judge O'Neill with the Arizona Supreme Court sealed the material that was released by the District of Columbia. The Ethics Committee then subpoenaed that information. And so my dilemma was either deny the subpoena, in other words, not cooperate with the subpoena, and then on the grounds that the Supreme Court had sealed the record, or to comply with the subpoena and then not being, having asked the court to seal it, then going and releasing it anyway. So I felt that if I defied the subpoena, that would be an excuse to reopen the ethics investigation at the Bar Association. They could use that as an excuse or a lever to discipline me. So I decided at that point that it sort of had gone far enough. I didn't have a win. I didn't have the support at that point of the Speaker of the House. And it wasn't that he was prejudging the merits of the matter, but he thought it was a scandal, that was a distraction, and that it made it difficult for them to carry on their business. It was like an open wound, and it would be better if I resigned. So I've always been a team player, and I didn't argue with the Speaker of the House at that point. I tendered my resignation, largely to protect my bar license, because even at that point, I realized at that point who my enemies were, who my opponents were, what the fight was really about. Had a lot to do with my support for criminal justice reform, which they opposed. And I decided to leave the House of Representatives, come back to Yavapai County, and run for county attorney in 2020, and that's exactly what I'm doing.
How long were you a lawyer, or have you been a lawyer?
I was admitted to the DC Bar in 1978. I was pretty young, and that was the first bar I was admitted to. At the time, I was not in private practice. I was working for the government. And this is something I rarely talk about because it was so long ago. But my first job coming out of college when I was about, that was 1970, I think, when I graduated. The big business, I lived in Washington, D.C., and I graduated from George Washington University in Washington, D.C. So my first job was with the government. And I sort of worked my way up with the government, but I ended up working in law enforcement agencies. I worked for the U.S. Customs Service. I was a branch chief with the Customs Service, and then I transferred over to the Department of Treasury, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. So I worked for a number of years for law enforcement agencies at a management level position. I started my career in 1970. I must have been about 21 or 22. I forget. I'd have to look at the calendar. But right out of college, I was selected as something called a management intern. Back in those days, to get a job with the government, you had to take a test. And if you had a score high enough, they could select you to be a management intern. And that's what happened to me. It was a very fortunate thing. I worked first for the Department of Commerce. And I was an intern with the Department of Commerce. I worked for the Weather Service. I worked for the Weather Service with the Department of Commerce. Then I moved around to several different agencies. I was not a law enforcement officer. I don't want to mislead them. I worked for law enforcement agencies as a management level official, primarily in the area of personnel management. I was a classification officer. I was head of the classification branch and that kind of thing for several different agencies.
Have you ever had a bar complaint, ever?
I can't say I've never had a bar complaint, because anybody can complain about I've never I have never had a bar complaint that was substantiated.
There you go.
Okay, you can always say I think my doctor did something
wrong. You can sue a ham sandwich in the.
Although I don't think I've had more than one or two. I remember one client whose probation was revoked was very mad because he said, "Well, my lawyer must be friends with the judge." And the Bar Association dismissed that complaint. But I do remember some what I would call frivolous complaints. But I have never been subject to any form of attorney discipline by any bar association. No bar association has ever found me to be at fault or at wrong or in need of some kind of sanction or discipline. I have an unblemished, quite frankly, an unblemished record as an attorney for over 40 years. 78 was that 42 years from 2020. I am a member of the District of Columbia Bar Association. I am still a member of the District of Columbia Bar Association, although I am inactive. I've left DC a number of years ago. I was admitted to practice law in the state of Maryland I believe in 91 or 92. And I was also licensed to be a certified public accountant in the state of Maryland. That was my state of primary residence. I was in the DC area, but most of the time I lived in Maryland, sometimes in Virginia, but mostly in Maryland. And that's where I had my home most of the time. That's where I had most of my investments. I lived for a long time in Baltimore and in College Park, Maryland, where I did a lot of real estate investing.
Let's move to 2020.
All right.
All right. So let's talk about, why do you want to run for county attorney? What is your reason?
Glenn, when I was in the legislature, I was my first term, 2016 to 2018. I was on the Judiciary Committee, and I was one of the few attorneys actually in the House of Representatives. I think there were just 2, maybe 3 of us when I was there in my first term, and in my second term, I was the only attorney in the Republican caucus. There were a couple of Democrat attorneys, but in the Republican side, I was the only one. In any event, one of the things I learned as I was looking at the legislation that was coming in is how tough Arizona's criminal justice system is. Most people are simply not aware. I was not aware when I moved to Arizona, because I wasn't involved with the criminal justice system, that just how tough it is. We have the 4th highest incarceration rate in the United States. The United States, compared to other countries, has a very high incarceration rate. But within the United States, we have the 4th highest incarceration rate in the state of in the United States. You have to look to states like Louisiana and Mississippi and so on like that to find states that have a tougher criminal justice system. And within the state of Arizona, Yavapai County has a much higher incarceration rate than the state average. And that struck me as extremely odd, because we think of Yavapai County, particularly the population centers here in Prescott and Prescott Valley, as being heavily retirement. Our average age, our demographic, is older than the state average, older than the national average. We have a lot of retired people here. There's actually a fairly low crime rate in Prescott. It's only in certain pockets that you find a lot of, or a certain amount of crime. So I was very surprised to see that, and I started looking into that, and I discovered that up until about the year 2000, the incarceration rate in Yavapai County was basically the same as the state average. We were locking up about 300 people per 100,000, which had been about the average for a long period of time. But in the year 2000, it started to diverge. And it is now, we have an incarceration rate about 25% higher than the state average. And that puzzled me, it interested me, how did that happen? And then of course, and this is not I don't mean this as a snarky comment, but in what I discovered is that in the year 2000, my opponent, the current incumbent, was first elected, and that's when the disparity began to appear. You can actually look at a chart and see how the state average goes on one level and the Yavapai County incarceration rate starts to increase. And as of right now, I believe the state average, the incarceration rate across the state, as of the latest data I have, which is from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, around 2017, the state average is around 318 persons per 100,000, and in Yavapai County it is over 400. So we're about 25% higher than the state average in terms of incarceration. Well, why is that important to this election? One of the debates going on in this community right now is the proposal to build a new jail out on Prescott Lakes Parkway. And this is to be a $70 million jail and judicial center. This has been proposed before. The voters have voted it down before. I believe twice. I was involved in the second round in 2014. I was actually general counsel to the committee that opposed what they call the jail tax increase. We currently have in Prescott, or in Yavapai County, excuse me, a 0.25% jail tax, jail district sales tax. The proposal was to double that jail district sales tax for 20 years, and it would have raised about $300 million. It was a huge tax increase, and it was specifically intended to build a new jail in Prescott, in the same location they're proposing now, out on Prescott Lakes Parkway. Well, there are a lot of people in the community that didn't think that was such a good idea. We got the jail census, and we discovered that there's a lot of low-level offenders in our jail. We're not just locking up bank robbers and major drug dealers.
The people who need to be in jail need to be in jail.
We all agree on that.
Yeah.
Everybody agrees that public safety is the first duty of government, and we all want a safe community. The problem is that we are locking up so many low-level nonviolent offenders that we're crowding the jail, and we don't have room for the people who really need to be there. And there are some people that need to be there. And believe me, I would prosecute those cases very aggressively. But I think what I would call the overzealous prosecution of low-level nonviolent offenders has driven up the incarceration rate in Yavapai County over a period of years, and that has pushed the jail population, pushed the jail census, and that's the argument that they're making to build a new jail. If we had more diversion opportunities, if we had, I would say, more common sense charging policies, if we didn't arrest so many people for things that are not even illegal, and we've been doing that lately here in Yavapai County, then we wouldn't have a crowded jail, and we wouldn't need to raise taxes on property owners right now. It's an 18% tax raise that the Board of Supervisors has just approved to build a $70 million jail. I think Prescott Lakes Parkway is the wrong place to build the jail. It's walking distance from residential areas and commercial areas. The crime is not here in Prescott. I heard one of the Board of Supervisor candidates the other day say 60% of all the arrests are in Prescott. That's absurd. They may bring them to Prescott and process them through the Gurley Street facility, but Prescott does not account for 60% of the crime in Yavapai County. That's an absurd argument to make. So I think the pockets of crime are, and I don't want to be demeaning to these jurisdictions because there's a lot of good people living there, but there is a higher crime rate in Prescott Valley and in Chino Valley and in Cordes Junction and various other places around the states. The crime is not coming from Prescott Lakes Parkway or from the Hacienda or from Stone Ridge. It's coming from lower socioeconomic areas of the area of the community, and we should put the jail probably out somewhere in Chino or Prescott Valley or someplace like that, nearer to where the crime is occurring. Prescott Lakes Parkway is not the place to put a new jail. And if we expand our diversion opportunities, if we establish a domestic violence court, we don't have one here in Prescott Valley. If we establish a veterans court, we don't have one here in Prescott. If we do more diversion for low-level nonviolent offenders, if we provide more help with drug treatment, if we provide more help with homelessness, we can save ourselves a huge amount of money. Yeah. It costs about $110 a day to keep somebody at our county jail. I saw in the paper just the other day, it was in March, where Yavapai County arrested and charged a couple of guys driving on I-40 transporting hemp. And the officer said, well, I thought it was marijuana. And they incarcerated these gentlemen, confiscated their car, confiscated the marijuana, held them in jail for 6 days for hemp. Hemp is legal. Hemp is a legal product. So that's another lawsuit that's coming to Yavapai County. There's a lawyer down in Phoenix who's getting ready to file a lawsuit on that right now. How could we be so stupid? And how could our county attorney's office charge somebody with felonies, hold them in jail for days for a legal product? And this is not an isolated incident. There's other instances of that kind
I'm
of
aware
thing.
of that incident, and I don't want to get in the weeds on that, but I think there's some other information on that as far as the packaging and some of the testing on that product. But
I understand what you're saying, Glenn, and I've read that stuff too. And of course, the county attorney's office, they know there's a lawsuit coming, and they're trying to put on information to calm the public concern about this. But let me just point out one fact in that case. The arresting officer, when he weighed the hemp, he didn't just weigh the hemp, he weighed the packaging. So instead of saying this is a
he didn't take a tear off it.
This isn't just $300 pounds worth of hemp. This is 400 and some pounds of hemp, and that's because he deliberately and knowingly weighed the packaging, which he knew was not hemp. In other words, he was trying to hype the case and make the case look like a bigger seizure than it really was. And that's the kind of thing that gets cops in trouble, and that's the kind of thing that gets the county in trouble.
Would there be a bigger charge if it was 300 pounds or 400
I
pounds?
think he was just trying to make it look like a bigger bust. Honestly, I don't know what all the circumstances are, and I'm not going to mention the officer's name because there are some other circumstances that may be extenuating. But these gentlemen happen to be African American, and I don't want to inflame public opinion on this, but it doesn't look good for the county to be charging hemp as a crime when it's a legal product. So we've got egg in our face on that one, and that's just one. There was another one a couple of years ago. It was I believe it was the Rodney Jones case, where a gentleman who was from, I believe from Maricopa County, again an African American, was pulled over, stopped here in Yavapai County. The officer asked him if he had anything illegal. This gentleman had a medical marijuana card, and he had some, I think it was hashish, that he had bought legally, okay? The officer called in, said, what should we do? And the answer came back, arrest him. This gentleman was arrested, he was charged, he got a 2.5-year sentence. That case went up to the Arizona Supreme Court, and Judge Brutinel, who's from Yavapai County, wrote the opinion. It was a unanimous opinion by the Arizona Supreme Court that the resin from marijuana was legalized by the medical marijuana referendum. And so this was simply a gentleman who spent a long time in jail, was housed at the Yavapai County Jail at $110 a day at taxpayer expense. Huge expense of litigating this case all the way up to the Supreme Court. We lost completely, Yavapai County completely lost that case. And it's an embarrassment, quite frankly, to Yavapai County. And my point is, Yavapai County, our current county attorney, was the only county attorney in the state of Arizona who was prosecuting resin as not being covered by the Medical Marijuana Act. So we were completely the outlier, and it had been going on for years. God knows how many people have been arrested and dragged into court and coerced into pleading guilty. We don't know how many of those cases were, but we know that this county, Yavapai County, was aggressively prosecuting those kinds of charges, which the Supreme Court has told us was totally illegal and improper. So that's the kind of thing that is driving our incarceration rate. That's the kind of thing that is driving increases in taxes. And that's the kind of thing, quite frankly, that is wasting resources that should be devoted to making our community safer by going after the violent predators and also going after criminal, illegal aliens. And that's the other area that I'm highlighting in my campaign.
Okay, let's talk about that. I was actually going to bring up one more thing before we go into that. And that is, I have friends who have been arrested for dumb things.
Yeah.
And they have, they're sentenced so much money, or you either pay a fine or you do time in the jail. Now, what they do at the time in the jail, like you pointed out, it's $110 a day to sit in the jail to pay your debt to society. Isn't there a better way for the people?
Are they paying their debt to society, or are we paying for them? Yeah.
We're paying for them, absolutely, my point. So my point, what I'm trying to say is, isn't there a better idea for the people who don't have the income to pay these huge fines?
Yeah.
What would be your solution for that, David? For the people who cannot pay the fines, keep them out of jail. Let's not pay them, as taxpayers. And, from where I came from, there used to be work crews on the streets or roads. There was cleaning hospitals, utilities, anything like that you would come up with.
So I'm a big proponent of community service. I think that people who actually do break the law, I think that they have certainly caused some costs, social costs. There are social consequences to the community when you break the law, and people ought to be held accountable and they ought to pay back. And there are ways to do that. I happen to think that incarcerating people, unless they're truly a danger to the community, and there's some who are and that need to be in jail for the safety of the community, but many people have committed crimes that are not necessarily danger.
Somebody who did something stupid.
A shoplifter, somebody urinating in the alley, somebody who's got in a fight with their girlfriend or something like that. Sort of low-level, non-violent offenders. There ought to be ways, and there are ways, to deal with these situations. On the issue of domestic violence, we see some horrendous things, by the way, and some repeat offenders, and obviously those people have to be dealt with in a serious way.
Sure.
But there's a lot of relatively minor cases that come through the system, and there should be a domestic violence court here in our county. We should also have a bigger diversion program. I happen to have practiced law in Washington, D.C. for about 25 years. I did a lot of criminal work back in Washington, D.C. I was one of the attorneys that was on the panels for these new, what they call problem-solving courts. The drug court, the first drug court, one of the first drug courts established in the United States was in the D.C. Superior Court, and I was one of the lawyers on the panel who handled those cases. I also was involved in the mental health court, the first mental health court that was set up, one of the first in the country. The domestic violence program, I was involved in that. Back in the, I believe in the late 1990s, and then the community court. I was involved in the community court in the District of Columbia up until the time I retired in about 2010. And they did a lot of prostitution, shoplifting, those kind of cases.
Petty,
yeah, trespassing, minor thefts between neighbors and things of that kind of thing. Those cases went to a community court, and if they were first offenders and they were nonviolent, they could be diverted out of the court system at a huge savings to the community. Those courts exist all over the country now, and we are way behind the curve. I won't say that we don't have any. I think there have been some recent efforts in that direction, but they seem after, our incumbent county attorney's been there for 20 years. Why are we so late to be adopting these things? Glenn, here in the state of Arizona, we have 15 counties. 12 of the 15 counties have veterans courts. We have a very large veteran population in Yavapai County, but we don't have a veterans court. Now, when I say that, they say, oh, well, Judge Mackey has a veterans court. Judge Mackey's he does, and that's a credit to him, but he is only able to review cases of veterans who are coming out of the system after they've completed their their sentence. We don't have a veterans court that screens cases at intake, and that's what a veterans court typically does. And that's where you have the opportunity to divert people out of the prison system, out of the criminal justice system, help that person, and also help the community.
And our intake veterans court is for felonies. And Mitch Padilla, who ran for office, came up with, we should have a veterans court for veterans going into the system for misdemeanors.
Absolutely.
Let's take care of those people who fought and served our country before they get into the felony area.
I support that tremendously. And, I guess the argument is, well, why should a veteran get any special treatment? Well, there's an answer to that. That veteran has made a sacrifice that most of us are not making. So that's a little consideration we can give to that person, particularly because so many veterans come back from these horrible wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and so on with drug problems, with post-traumatic stress, with difficulties reintegrating themselves into the community. They end up homeless, they end up with family problems, and they get involved in the criminal justice system. I believe very strongly that we should do more for these folks. Not somebody who's committing a serious violent crime or dealing drugs or something like that, but there's a lot of low-level stuff that can be successfully diverted. You asked me about what are my solutions to people who can't pay their fines and things of that nature. I'm a strong believer, as I mentioned, in community service. And it isn't just necessarily, cleaning up the trash on the road. I think there's a need for that as well. But there are a lot of things. You can volunteer at the Humane Society. There's a lot of different things that you can do in the community to pay back the community for your mistake, if you will. I also think we need to provide more sentences that are community-based. When we send somebody off to the state prison system, they lose contact with their family. They're in quite frankly, a very degraded environment. It's a terrible environment to be in prison. It's a very ugly situation. We provide very few programs for the people we send to our prison system. Very few people who have drug problems that go into the state prison system are actually going to get drug treatment. So we may lock them up for 5 years, but when they come home, they've still got the same issues and the same problem, and that is what contributes to recidivism. I think the last number I saw is that 50% of the people in our state prison system had been there before. Now that's not because I think these are just irredeemable bad people. I think it's because they went into the system, they spent their whatever sentence they had, and then they came back with to the community with the same problems. We need to do much, much more on reentry programs. We need to do much, much more on treatment and rehabilitation, and that includes education, job skills, things of that nature. But we also need to maybe not send so many of our own local citizens to the state prison system. So I'd like to see more sentences that are based on, sort of a house arrest concept. You can stay home in your own home and pay your rent and keep up your car note and take care of your child support, but you can't be out after 6 o'clock. You got to stay home on weekends. In other words, sort of a house arrest type of program. There's also something called high intensity supervision, which they were starting to bring in back in Maryland and DC when I was phasing out of my law practice. But basically it's about putting people on much closer supervision, putting them on probation, but if they're at risk of reoffending, you provide additional support in the community. Maybe they report to their probation officer every day. Maybe they wear an ankle bracelet. Maybe they're restricted from going to certain areas. But keeping people at home, keeping people working, keeping people contributing to society is a much, much more efficient, cost-efficient way and a more humane way of dealing with people who get involved with the criminal justice system. And we can save ourselves a ton of money. We wouldn't need that 18% property tax increase.
Well, thanks, David, for giving us your view on some of the things that we can do rather than locking people up.
I appreciate that.
But let's finish up our little time that we talked together on the immigration issue. I know that I've watched your commercials, and I've seen that you talk about our current attorney being soft on immigration. I've seen the sheriff come back and say, absolutely not. They're not. She's not. She's very tough on immigration. Where do you stand on that? And can you give us a little bit of background why you feel that she is soft on immigration?
I appreciate that. Appreciate you bringing that up. I'm looking here at an article that Ms. Polk wrote. That was published in the Daily Courier a few years ago, in which she endorses, and actually I think she was a member of, an organization called SANE. And this is an organization that supported amnesty for illegal immigrants. It supported extending additional visas to people from Mexico. It basically supported not enforcing our current immigration laws. This is a program that had been supported by, and I don't know specifically that people like Senator Flake and John McCain and so on like that endorsed this particular program, but these were the kinds of programs that were being supported by, I will say, the liberal wing of the Republican Party, the Romney, Flake, McCain wing of the Republican Party, that was supporting open borders, that was supporting a much more lenient kind of immigration program, and not deporting criminal aliens from, and it isn't just criminal aliens, by the way. Anybody who comes across our border without permission is committing a crime. They are a criminal alien, whether they're actually going out and committing a crime or not once they get here. It is illegal to be in our country without going through the immigration process. And remember now, Glenn, there are millions of people all over the world who are standing in line, waiting in line, often for years, to get a legal visa to immigrate to the United States. People who have come here illegally, they've brought drugs, they've brought diseases, they've brought all kinds of social issues with them across the border. They've come unchecked, and they present a tremendous burden to our communities. For example, people who are here illegally, they have a right to medical care. If they go over to the Yavapai County Regional Medical Center and say, I've got a medical issue here, I hurt my leg, I broke my arm, I'm pregnant, I'm going to have a baby, we have to take care of these people. When I say we, I mean the taxpayers of Yavapai County. If they have children, they can take them over to the district or government-run schools, and they can enroll their children in our school system. The law does not allow the school system to reject these children. So these children who are here illegal, or the children of illegals, we are required to educate these children, okay? And that means that we are denying, we have limited resources, we are denying resources to our own children to educate children of illegals. They burden our criminal justice system, tremendous problems with crime, smuggling, drugs. All this is traced to illegal immigration. And I'm afraid that my opponent has a long record of being soft on illegal immigration and
Can
endorse.
you give us the
Yes,
date and
this is just one. I'm sure there are many others, but this is one that I was able to pull this morning. It was a talk of the town piece published in the Prescott Daily Courier in December of 2012. I also found that when I read that I was alarmed when I read that back in when it was published, and I actually wrote a letter to the editor, which again they published. So she's on record as having had all these associations with organizations that support liberalization of our immigration laws, that she's spoken out against. She's never supported President Trump. She's never supported the border wall. She's simply been missing in action on the immigration issue. So as county attorney, I want to be very clear about this. One of my first acts of county attorney will be to change the priorities of the county attorney's office. We are going to identify people who are in our county illegally. We are going to detain them, and we are going to turn them over to federal authorities for deportation. I can't control the borders of Arizona, but as county attorney, I can control the borders of Yavapai County. I will never allow Yavapai County to become a sanctuary for illegal immigrants. And that's my promise and my pledge to the voters.
Thank you, David. And one of the things I was thinking while you were talking about the medical, going over to the medical facilities, we're never going to deny somebody life-saving.
We can't. That would be inhumane.
Medical. That would be inhumane. But if they're found to be illegally in the country at that point, once they're recuperated or we help them in that facility, they should be turned over to ICE and deported.
So, and
today, they're just released back into our
right. So the answer to that the pro-immigrant people would say, well, if you're going to detain them when they go in for medical assistance, they're not going to go in for medical assistance. Or if you are going to report their children as being here illegally when they enrolled in school, then they're not going to get an education. So it's a tremendous problem, and I do see the argument there. But is the argument to say, well, we're just going to shrug our shoulders and say, once they're here, I guess we have to take care of them at taxpayer expense? I think that's a terrible answer, and that's why I support President Trump. I support the wall. I support it very strongly, and I think the most humane thing to do is to send the message that illegal immigrants are simply not welcome in Yavapai County. They're not welcome anywhere, in my opinion, but I don't have control over the whole state. I don't have control over the country, but I would, as county attorney, have control over Yavapai County, and I would send a very clear message. We are not a sanctuary for illegal immigrants in Yavapai County. If you're an illegal immigrant and you want something free from the government, go to Phoenix, go to someplace else that is happy to see you. I understand Tucson has flirted with becoming a sanctuary city. Go where they want you. Don't come up here and burden the taxpayers and the citizens of Yavapai County.
Thanks, David. Is there anything else that you'd like to hit on? Because I'm pretty much out of questions.
Well, I ended up saying a lot more than I had planned to say.
Well, there's a lot to say, Dave.
I appreciate that, and I would simply say that if I'm given the opportunity to be the Yavapai County Attorney, I think that with new policies that I will be able to probably postpone the need for a new jail in Yavapai County, and we'll postpone it long enough to do a thorough study of where that jail really should be located. I don't think it would be responsible for me to say, because Yavapai County is a growing county, that we will never need a new jail. But I do think I can say that we don't need this particular jail, and before we start raising taxes to build a new jail facility, let's be sure that we've exhausted every opportunity to optimize the jail that we have and to reduce that jail population, because it simply costs a lot of money. We are literally, in Yavapai County, taking school books out of the hands of our children to enforce our laws and to build jails and to lock people up. And that's just crazy. So we really need to look at that very closely, and I hope to be able to do something about that. The other thing I want to say is that one of my first acts, maybe my very first act as county attorney, will be to freeze the budget of the county attorney's office. Under the current incumbent, that office now has grown to about 100 employees. And their budget is about $9 million a year. About 100 employees, $9 million a year. Do the math. That's $90,000 per employee. Now, they don't all make that. Some of the senior lawyers, of course, make more, and there's probably paralegals and clerical help that makes much less. But that's a huge budget. And I think we can do something about that. And to fund some of the programs that I want to establish, like maybe a domestic violence court or a veterans court, where are we going to get the money to do that? Where are we going to get the money to hire more probation officers to do the intensive supervision that would ultimately end up reducing costs down the road, but would require some initial outlay? Well, I'm going to freeze the budget of the county attorney's office, and I'm going to reduce that budget by about 10% over the 4 years that I'm in office. And that will free up $900,000, and that money will go to fund the salaries of those probation officers who will then be able to keep people out of jail and lower our overall costs, and to fund some of these problem-solving courts like a veterans court and a domestic violence court. So we don't need to raise the budget of the county attorney's office. We don't need to raise taxes. All the money that we need to start expanding these diversion-type programs, these money-saving type programs, is right within the current county attorney's budget. So that's what I'll do. Freeze the budget and ask the county board of supervisors to reprogram that money into programs that actually end up reducing costs throughout our entire county government.
Thank you, David.
I appreciate
your
it.
time.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
You bet. And as always, folks, we always wind up with thanking our current and prior serving military for giving it your service, for letting us be able to sit at our table and discuss these issues. And our law enforcement and fire departments, we're behind you 100%.
Absolutely.
You guys are.
Can we say that Blue Lives Matter? Can we conclude?
Blue lives do
Blue
matter.
Lives Matter.
Absolutely.
I want the viewers to know I can be critical of the government, but I understand that Blue Lives Matter, and I support our police and our law enforcement 1,000%.
If it wasn't for them, we would be in a
They're the
whole
ones that
different
keep
problem.
us safe. You bet.
And with that, thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day.